It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, our top story. A massive boost to Britain's defence budget. The Prime Minister pledges to increase spending and puts the defence industry on a war footing.
We have to recognise that the world, as I said, is in a more dangerous place than it's been since the end of the Cold War.
Also tonight, 5 people die in the Channel just hours after the Rwanda bill is passed, as Sky News films dozens more migrants arriving in small boats. The United Nations calls for an independent investigation into mass graves in Gaza as families search for their loved ones. Prosecutors call for Donald Trump to be fined for making public attacks on witnesses. Plus, going into reverse over 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in Wales. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's coming up in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight. Hello there, good evening. The Prime Minister has announced a big increase to Britain's defence budget, £75 billion over the next 6 years. Speaking in Poland, Rishi Sunak said there was a new pace and intensity emerging of threats against the UK, with an ever greater risk of authoritarian regimes acting together. We'll have analysis from our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, in a moment. But first, our political editor, Beth Rigby, reports from Warsaw.
The Prime Minister touching down in Poland, flanked by his Chancellor and Defence Secretary, off the plane and on a war footing. The Prime Minister at a Polish military base, shoulder to shoulder with NATO's Secretary-General and his Polish counterpart Donald Tusk, coming together as they contemplate a more dangerous world, and the PM offering more money for more of this. £500 million to help halt Putin at Poland's border.
Today I'm announcing the biggest strengthening of our national defence for a generation. We will increase defence spending to a new baseline of 2.5% of GDP by 2030. That starts today and rises steadily in each and every year. Over the next 6 years, we'll invest an additional £75 billion in our defence. And it will be fully funded with no increase in borrowing or debt. Today is a landmark moment in the defence of the United Kingdom. This is a generational investment in British security and British prosperity. It makes us safer at home and stronger abroad.
A sign of the times this PM feels we're living in, harking back to the man who led us through the Second World War.
As Churchill said in 1934, to urge the preparation of defence is not to insert the imminence of war. We did not choose this moment, but it falls to us to meet it.
You talk about Europe being at a turning point and this spending putting the UK on a war footing. Have we entered a pre-war era?
I quoted Churchill earlier, that we have to recognise that the world, as I said, is in a more dangerous place than it's been since the end of the Cold War. Now, this is not something new. What is new is, I think, the pace and intensity of where we're seeing these threats emerge.
We are safe as long as we stand together. I cannot tell you exactly what the next crisis or the next war will be, but what I can tell you is that if we stand together, we will be able to protect and preserve peace for NATO allies.
On St George's Day, here we are.
This PM mindful of voters at home too. As threats increase, so does the cost of peace. But his first priority clear. The security of his citizens matters above all else. Europe's at a turning point and the UK's defence industry is on a war footing. The Prime Minister here in Poland with a clear message. He will be a strong leader in dangerous times. But there's a domestic play here too. He has now announced that defence funding his party so longed for, and the hope will be it might appeal too to some lapsed Conservative voters, all quite handy ahead of the local elections. And questions now for Labour, which has promised to lift defence spending to 2.5% of GDP as soon as resources allow.
In Parliament, in our politics, we've stood united on the question of Ukraine since the conflict began. We will continue to do so. So I support the money the Prime Minister has put forward and urge all allies to work together on this.
The PM arriving in Berlin tonight, opening a new chapter in our defence partnership. Whether he'll be here to deliver that is another question as we eye that general election. But his spending choices set a challenge for fellow Europeans and Keir Starmer too.
And Beth is in Berlin now, where the Prime Minister has arrived. And Beth, you were with Mr Sunak on the plane from Poland to Germany this evening. This was a significant spending announcement, wasn't it?
Yes, and I have to say he was a Prime Minister in a buoyant mood this evening on that brief flight over from Warsaw to Berlin. He's delivered a hat-trick of announcements in recent days. His welfare plan, he's got the Rwanda bill through Parliament, and now the big one, perhaps, the biggest, if you like, his commitment to defence spending to raise it to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. So he's getting the announcements out of the traps. And I have to say, for once, after what has been a difficult period for him, he actually seemed to me like he was enjoying the job. He seemed very fired up. And this is a big commitment. He was clear it was a choice, and he thinks he's made the right one in terms of where to put spending. And why? Well, he talked about the axis of authoritarianism, Russia, Iran, China, telling me about the pace and intensity in which they're working together, picking up, and therefore a need for increased spending. He talked about Europe being at a turning point, the difficult summer ahead for Ukraine, and that if Russia is allowed to succeed, then it would expand its aggression beyond the Polish border. And he finally talked about his first duty as a Prime Minister is keeping the country safe. Well, now there are choices. There are choices for the Europeans. He talked about if everyone increased it to 2.5%, there would be an annual £140 billion increase in the NATO budget. There's also a choice for Keir Starmer. Does he now commit to these spending commitments in a manifesto and have other choices around public services? This is a Prime Minister in waiting who really wants to be seen as strong on defence, so a real dilemma for him too. And as for the Prime Minister, well, tonight he is feeling, I think, invigorated. He's got the local elections next week. It could put him back on his heels, but for now he seems pretty pepped up.
Beth, live for us there in Berlin. Thank you. So let's take a closer look then at the new defence commitment. Well, the Prime Minister promised an extra £75 billion in defence spending over the next 6 years. And that, by the end of the decade, total defence spending is to reach £87 billion, increasing the UK's spend to 2.5% of GDP, up from the current 2.25%. The government has pledged an additional £10 billion over the next 10 years to boost munitions production, nearly doubling the UK's current spend on producing ammunition and missiles. And the Prime Minister has committed another £500 million to Ukraine to help its defence against Russia. But let's speak now to Sky's security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes. So putting the defence industry on a war footing, with so many demands on government spending right now, why is this so necessary? Why this priority?
Well, the Defence Secretary has said that we are a pre-war world, and all of the signs are of a world that's becoming increasingly darker, more hostile, more challenges towards liberal, free democracies like the UK, like our NATO allies. And it's a return, really, to that Cold War situation where you had authoritarian states, the Soviet Union versus the West, and where you've got Russia on a war footing, where you've got China watching how Russia is conducting its war in Ukraine, where you've got Iran increasingly hostile and increasingly willing and ready to launch attacks, then the time has to come, defence insiders say, to increase not just defence spending. It's not about the money so much, it's about the output. So putting defence industry on a war footing is one way of talking about ramping up that production. But until you actually see the reality of it, it's meaningless rhetoric, and that is the concern tonight. The Prime Minister Minister might be feeling proud and buoyed by the language that he's used today. But I can tell you that people inside defence are quite confused. The only new money for the military from this announcement this year is £500 million that's going to Ukraine. There's no new money for defence. It's all coming after the election. And who knows who's going to be calling the shots then?
Deborah Haynes, thank you. 5 people, including a 7-year-old child, have died while trying to cross the channel in a small boat. French authorities describe the vessel as heavily overcrowded, with more than 100 people on board. Well, the tragedy happened just hours after the Rwanda bill was passed, which the government says will act as a deterrent to those who seek to come to the UK this way. Our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, has this report.
Celebrating as they head towards Britain, nearly 60 migrants on an inflatable dinghy with chaos and tragedy in their wake. Many were not meant to be on this boat. We're told dozens rushed aboard at the last moment, like these men in blue jackets, hijacking the boat, pushing the number to 112 passengers. It was too much, and when the boat hit a sandbar, people fell in, and a major rescue operation was triggered. Most were saved, but 5 died. 3 men, a woman, and a small girl. For Sandrine, the grief was personal. She recognised the child who died, knew her family.
I saw them bringing in the bodies on stretchers, and I saw the little girl who I knew. Her father fell into my arms, and I said to myself, this can't be possible. She's a child. They tried to resuscitate her. The helicopters arrived, but she died. And then there were 4 other bodies.
Abandoned on the promenade, the soaking clothes of those who perished.
112 migrants, c'est du jamais vu. Donc il y a eu vraiment une volonté peut-être dans un
112 migrants is unheard of, so there was a real desire, perhaps because of the improved weather, to increase the number of people in the boat, with dire consequences, which we deplore this morning. The coastal roads full of activity, more migrants led away by police after further failed crossings. But many do succeed. Remember the men in blue jackets. Here's their boat in UK waters as a British lifeboat escorts them to England. The number of small boats crossing the channel is up, and already we've seen more deaths than we did in the entirety of 2023. That's why the government says it needs the Rwanda legislation as a deterrent. For some of these people, the UK is a last hope of claiming asylum. Like these migrants we spoke to, many had tried to settle elsewhere in Europe and told us they were threatened with deportation.
Everyone wants to go to UK. Why? Because we have a problem. European country deport. Yeah, deport. In here, deport.
So you have to leave France?
Yes, France, Deutschland, but deport.
The Rwanda legislation will now enable the government to send people like this to Africa, but there's little sign here it would be a deterrent. You think that Britain would not send you to Rwanda? That wouldn't happen?
No, Rwanda, no. Rwanda, Africa.
No,
Rwanda, Africa, no good. No safe.
You think life would be a lot better in the UK?
Yes.
This coastline is long and wavering, and it's hard to police. Overnight, 5 smugglers were arrested, but at dawn, we filmed a series of boats, all setting off to cross the channel. There is no sign here that the flow is slowing. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Wimereux.
Well, the tragedy at sea happened, as we heard, just hours after the government's controversial Rwanda bill was passed, after 2 years of delay. Sky's Becky Johnson has been speaking to asylum seekers in Derby, some who have already been warned they could be sent to Rwanda.
You are all welcome here in Derby, and it is important that your voices can be heard by the Home Office in London.
The welcome from this charity in stark contrast with the government's intention to send people here to Rwanda. Several of these asylum seekers have been told they're being considered for removal. Hamza, who's from Iran, received this letter from the Home Office saying it may ask Rwanda whether it would admit him. I'm very stressed, he tells me. I don't know what to do. All I can think about is this letter and Rwanda. Most people here arrived recently on small boats. Then Rwanda was a risk. Now they fear it's a reality. They're in limbo, waiting to know if, when and how they'll be removed.
Rwanda is not a safe place.
Does it make you regret coming to the UK?
Yeah, if before I came here, you say that, they sent to me in Rwanda, I never come here.
Fatima doesn't regret leaving Afghanistan.
I fled my country in order to be safe, yeah? Otherwise, I'm gonna killed by Taliban.
How do you feel that you could now get sent to Rwanda?
It is not fair, especially for the one who came from Afghanistan.
Outside the meeting, Masood, who's from Iran, reveals an email confirming he too is being considered for Rwanda. Would you have come to the UK if you'd have known you could end up in Rwanda?
Never. Never.
Do you think it will stop other people coming now?
Yeah. I say to all asylum, don't come to UK.
His words could be seized on by the government as evidence the Rwanda plan will work as a deterrent. But more migrants have crossed the channel so far this year than in the same period last year. And the policy now relies on flights actually taking off, unlike this failed attempt to get the first migrants to Rwanda back in 2022. The Prime Minister says an airfield is on standby and planes have been booked. But ministers accept there could again be appeals and delays.
It's inevitable, I'm afraid, there are going to be challenges. It's inevitable that people are going to try and throw everything at this to try and stop this plan from working.
10 to 12 weeks is the pledge for getting planes away. And if that doesn't happen, there's a risk many migrants will go back to seeing Rwanda as an empty threat. And the numbers matter too. There are more than 50,000 people potentially eligible. If just a tiny fraction go, asylum seekers could still fancy their chances of being able to stay in Britain. With an election looming, the views of voters will be key. Back in Derby, feelings are mixed.
A truly ludicrous thing to do. I don't understand how or why simply sending people to another country helps anything.
Pretty sure it's going to cost a lot of money, so when that could be put into other places.
Would you prefer that they were sent to Rwanda then remained here?
Most probably, yes.
But the Prime Minister has defined success as stopping the boats. If planes go to Rwanda but migrants keep coming, the government will face accusations that its plan has failed. Becky Johnson, Sky News, Derby.
Now that the Israeli army has withdrawn from parts of Gaza, the dead are being identified from amongst the rubble. But the United Nations Human Rights Chief is calling for an independent investigation into mass graves in the south of the Strip. Nasser Hospital in the second city of Khan Yunis was one of the largest in Gaza, but Israel claimed that Hamas was using it as a base. And Israeli forces surrounded the area. Staff buried dozens of bodies there. But after Israeli troops entered the hospital, satellite images and video verified by Sky News shows that soldiers operated heavy machinery in the makeshift cemetery. A warning that this report from our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle and our team in Gaza contains distressing images of dead bodies from the start.
When the hospital morgues ran out of room, they turned to the car park. In protective suits and masks, with death all around them, the civil volunteers uncover this mass grave, pulling the bodies from the sandy earth, one by one. Israeli forces have now withdrawn from Khan Yunis, but before they did, they too dug up these corpses. The IDF says they were looking for hostages, but Palestinians and the UN have accused them of desecrating the dead. Over the last 5 days, they've found more than 300 bodies, and they're digging for more. Each one is unwrapped. Inside are the decomposing bodies of men, women, and young children. If a body cannot be identified or isn't collected by family, They're rewrapped in clean sheets and buried again in unmarked graves. Moya Yed found his mother yesterday. It took him time to recognise what was left of her. He's back again today, still looking for his sister, father and cousin.
Solve this issue with the world. Solve it with the Israelis. We want a solution. We want to rest. There's no life. It's all for nothing. I feel sad, lonely, alone in the world.
Every so often, someone finds what they had come looking for, but hadn't wanted to believe. After 2 months searching for him, the body of Karima's youngest son, Ahmed, has just been uncovered. They took him from me, they killed him, she screams. Israel, America, and Britain are to blame, she wails. The bodies are gently laid out in the shade. The names, if known, written on each one. Karima sits by her son, but surrounded by so many others. A moment of silence for her, alone in her own thoughts. Later that day, Ahmed is taken to the cemetery for a proper burial. Karima helps carry him through the streets of Khan Yunis, where nothing or no one has been left untouched.
I spent 2 months, 2.5 months of me looking for him. Thank God, I was scared that he was thrown for dogs or cats to eat him, just like I saw dogs eat other dead bodies with my own eyes.
The final act of a grieving mother is to bury her son next to his father and her husband. With the 2 men of Karima's family now side by side in death. The cries of anger turn to prayer and tears of overwhelming grief. Alistair Buncle, Sky News, in Jerusalem.
It's not been the best day for Donald Trump at his hush money trial. Even before the court sat, he was warned he could be held in contempt for comments that prosecutors say have broken a gag order. The former publisher of the National Enquirer, David Pecker, returned to the witness box for a second day. Mr. Trump denies falsifying business records in connection with a payment to the former porn star Stormy Daniels in 2016. Our US correspondent James Matthews reports from New York.
Day 2 of courtroom evidence and a firmer hand on the case against Donald Trump. The prosecution picture is of a man who buried bad news ahead of the 2016 election. They said he planned it with associates of influence in a meeting in Trump Tower in 2015. Present in the building was David Pecker, former publisher of the National Enquirer magazine, along with Trump and his former lawyer. Together they hatched the hush money scheme at the heart of the prosecution case. Pecker told the court that in the meeting, he agreed to be Trump's eyes and ears, to publish positive stories about him and negative articles about his opponents.
A lot of details about Trump because Pecker really seems to know him pretty well. And so the jury is getting to know him, which is something helpful in terms of how and why it would be that they would eventually gather together to try to make efforts to impact, if you accept the prosecution's theory, to eventually impact his campaign.
It wasn't all witness evidence inside the courtroom on the 15th floor. There was the matter of a gag order on Donald Trump, warning him not to make statements about witnesses or jurors. The prosecution presented examples of when they said Donald Trump had breached the gag order. He knows what he's not allowed to do, they said, and he does it anyway. The judge reserved judgment on the issue, but not before he'd shown impatience with the arguments of Trump's attorney. You're losing all credibility with this court, he told him. This was court action in the pursuit of a prosecution for Donald Trump. Once again, it was court as a campaigning platform.
This is all Biden, just in case anybody has any question. And they're keeping me in a courtroom, it's freezing, by the way, in a courtroom all day long. Well, he's out campaigning.
It was business as usual outside the criminal court building. albeit with an eye on the business unusual inside.
I think it's a political stunt to get him out of the race and get him off the campaign trail.
It should be like all criminal trials in the hands of the jury, and that everyone should follow the law.
And hopefully, you know, it'll come out with justice being done. But, you know, my feeling is he's done wrong.
Outside the court building, the crowds have thinned for this historic case. History isn't what it used to be, notwithstanding the significance of a story still being written. James Matthews, Sky News in New York.
Ireland's Prime Minister Simon Harris has issued a state apology for the Stardust nightclub fire in which 48 people died in 1981. An inquest jury found emergency exits were locked or otherwise obstructed, and victims were prevented from being able to exit. The inquiry ruled that they were unlawfully killed following a 40-year campaign for justice by their families.
I know there have been many, many times when you thought this day would never come. I know that you were forced to endure a living nightmare, which began when your loved ones were so cruelly snatched from you in a devastating fire. I am deeply sorry that you were made to fight for so long that they went to their graves never knowing the truth. Today we say formally and without any equivocation, we are sorry.
Many roads in Wales could return to 30 miles an hour by the end of the year, just months after a 20-mile-an-hour rule limit was introduced. A call for the policy to be scrapped broke Senedd records for the most signed petition on its website, and now new guidance means that local councils can start changing the limits back. Greg Milam sent this report.
If you're looking for a place where people have been driven to distraction by 20-mile-per-hour speed zones, it is here in Buckley. The town was home to one of the pilot schemes for the policy of making 20 the default speed limit. For months, drivers reported confusion and road rage. And 6 months after that policy took effect across Wales, new guidance means councils can now switch back. The result of public anger and a petition of nearly 500,000 signatures. And no one in Buckley is surprised.
I do agree that 20 mile an hour in streets and housing estates is good. But, I mean, I work in the butchers in the precincts in there, and we had a lot of people used to come in and say that they wouldn't come to Buckley anymore and all that type of stuff. But, like I say, looking at the roads and stuff like that, I don't think like many people do the 20 anyway.
I think the 20 miles an hour has just left a lot of drivers confused as to which roads are 20 and which roads are 30. So actually just streamlining it all back to 30 would probably make everyone's lives easier.
It's a crazy decision in the first place because bikes are more efficient now, they've got better braking. It's crazy to reduce it, but also the environmental impact because people are travelling at a slower gear for a longer period of time, so it's causing more pollution. Crazy decision in the first place.
This is Jubilee Road in Buckley, and campaigners say it's roads like this that illustrate what they see as a problem with the 20-mile-per-hour limit. This isn't a residential area in itself, but it does have pathways and roads that lead to residential areas. And they say so many drivers are trying to avoid Jubilee Road because of the 20-mile-per-hour limit that it shifted traffic and problems to other alternative routes. The campaigners say the U-turn misses the point of the 20-mile-per-hour limit.
If you're hit by a car at 20 miles an hour, it's reckoned that's equivalent to falling out of a first floor window. Not something which you want to do if you had a choice. But if you're hit by a car at 30 miles an hour, it's like falling out of a third floor window. And they can see that there's a huge difference in the potential damage which there is to people.
There'll be financial help for authorities that changed signs at a cost of millions to change them back. It's not clear how many roads that will actually be. There will still be lower limits around places like schools, but for campaigners, this is the reverse they've been looking for. Greg Milam, Sky News, Buckley.
Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview tonight, joined by the journalist and broadcaster, Jenny Kleeman, and the deputy comment editor at the Daily Telegraph, Annabel Denham. Welcome to both of you. And certainly among the stories we will be discussing, this on the front of the Metro: let this be the last Channel tragedy, their headline for tomorrow's newspaper. Back with that and more in just a moment. Well, this is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. First, though, a reminder of our top stories this evening. Rishi Sunak puts the defence industry on a war footing as he announces tens of billions of pounds in extra defence funding over the next 6 years. 5 people, including a young girl, have drowned trying to cross the English Channel in an overcrowded small boat. French authorities said at least 100 people were on board the dinghy. And the judge in Donald Trump's hush money trial is deciding whether the former president should be punished for violating a gag order by criticising those involved in the case on social media. Hello there, watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and the deputy comment editor at The Telegraph, Annabel Denham, with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome to both of you. So let's take a look at the front pages, shall we? Kicking off with the Eye, which leads with Rishi Sunak's defence spending increase, calling it the UK's biggest hike to military spending in a generation. The Daily Mail reports on the Prime Minister saying the £75 billion boost puts Britain's defence industry on a war footing. The Guardian reporting on Mr Sunak's commitment to supply Ukraine with a minimum of £3 billion annually as part of the increase. The Telegraph also highlights Rishi Sunak's commitment to increase defence spending. And The Times leading with a similar headline about the Prime Minister's moving the nation's defence budget to a war footing. The front of the Metro has the headline, "Let this be the last Channel tragedy," after a 7-year-old girl was among 5 people killed while attempting to reach the UK from France in an overcrowded dinghy. The Express leads with the boost to Britain's defence budget, saying Rishi Sunak will axe 70,000 civil service jobs to help pay for the commitment. The Financial Times leads with the Bank of England's warning that lenders are in the dark over private equity risks. And a photo of Prince Louis taken to mark his 6th birthday is on the front page of the Sun newspaper. And while defence spending is on many of the front pages, as you saw, the front of the Daily Star says Kim Jong-un's favourite imperialist gardener has launched his own war on slugs. Well, that was the jeans story, wasn't it, if you remember? A reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you listen to our guests. So let's head straight to Jenny Kleeman and Annabel Denham. Welcome to both of you. I mean, Annabel, kick off, why don't you? This great announcement in Warsaw, you know, half the cabinet seemed turned up, but not quite. So how significant is this moment, do you think? 75 billion extra in defence spending over the next 6 years and the UK's defence industry now on a war footing.
Yes, that's right. It's an absolutely massive intervention from the Prime Minister. Let's not forget, it's only coming weeks after the spring budget when he insisted that defence spending as a proportion of GDP would rise to 2.5% when economic conditions allow. Well, I'm not sure the Prime Minister himself would have been expecting circumstances to change quite so quickly. However, I think that there has been a dawning realisation among those senior players in the government that the world is becoming an increasingly unsafe place. We had the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps at the start of the year talking about how the peace dividend was over, how we were going to have to commit to spending more on our national security, on ensuring that we can keep Brits safe, as well as supporting our allies in whichever conflicts they find themselves in. The axis of evil is coalescing between Russia, China and Iran. We're seeing a lot of evidence of that. These are countries which want to weaken, or if not weaken, then supplant the West and create a new world order. And we absolutely need to be prepared for that. And Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the chief of the defence staff, writing in the Telegraph today, pointed out that, you know, it shows that Britain has lost none of her resolve, and that in all great conflicts, the UK has been aware in advance because we've prevailed because we've been aware in advance of what is at stake. And I think that this is Rishi Sunak really setting out that we could be in a 1930s moment, and we absolutely do need to be prepared.
Yes, and it's being sold as this biggest, you know, boost to military spending in a generation. But for some commentators, we're catching back to where we were. For example, after the end of the Cold War, just under 5%. Tony Blair, out of office, 2.5%. It's gone down with the Tories, and now it's beginning to go up again. So it's where we were, Jenny.
Yes, it's where we were, and certainly not where we were in the Cold War. And, you know, the rhetoric of all of this being very much about we're in this pre-war footing, this axis of authoritarian states that we are up against, you know. In terms of proportion of GDP, our defence spending is nothing like, or is going to be nothing like it was during the Cold War. So much of the money that we used to spend on defence is now going on the NHS. That still needs to be paid for, the NHS. So the question arises, where is this money going to come from? I mean, defence spending, huge sums like this, normally not announced outside of a budget. There have been rumours today or suggestions today that it's going to come from cuts for the civil service.
Which in the Express,
The Express is saying 70,000 jobs will be axed. This is an enormous number of jobs. And if these jobs were jobs that could have gone, surely they would have gone sometime in the previous decade. So it does seem kind of fanciful, but there is absolutely no doubt that we've had successive defence ministers calling for a greater proportion of GDP to go on defence spending. We need money for munitions. We have a recruitment crisis in defence. We also have, you know, procurement budget management issues when you're talking about the nuclear deterrent. There are huge holes in our funding that need to be plugged. It seems that Rishi Sunak has been called upon by successive defence ministers to make good on this commitment that Boris Johnson made in 2022. He's picked this particular occasion of being with Donald Tusk, of being on the edge, you know, it's all very cinematic and talking in front of the troops to make this pledge. He is putting pressure on the Labour Party to step up and say that they're going to do the same. But how it's going to be done really is still very much the question now.
Yes, and we see the Secretary General of NATO there. 2% of GDP is the target. We know the Americans pay more. We know that Donald Trump was very demanding of this when he was in power. You know, we know there's a US election coming up as well, don't we? But let's take a look at the Daily Telegraph. Ben Wallace has been writing for them, the former Defence Secretary. And, you know, earlier today, he said, well, I spoke to Rishi Sunak and, you know, there was something we were going to put in the manifesto before the election. We've decided not to do it. Well, what gets junked for this? Because people want spending on public services, don't they, as well as possibly defence spending?
Indeed, polls have consistently shown that if there is fiscal headroom, people would rather that it went towards public spending on public services than towards tax cuts. Perhaps it will be tax cuts that are reduced in the manifesto. Perhaps the Tories will promise to chip away further at national insurance. Certainly that's their intention, rather than bringing in some kind of, perhaps an income tax cut, which of course would be more costly to the Exchequer. We just don't know at this stage. But what we do know is that Penny Mordaunt wrote at the weekend that voters care about defence. I think that there's been an assumption among many politicians that there aren't votes in it, so it doesn't get the attention that it deserves. But in fact, people understand that we need to have, we cannot have a hollowed-out military, and that we need to ensure that we have a voice on the international stage, and that having a strong military enables us to achieve that. And people also are aware that the world is becoming a less safe place, that we have this rise of authoritarian countries which are coming together, and it's not something that we can, you know, where we can just kick the can down the road. But I mean, we go back to people want potholes dealt with. They want, you know, schools dealt with. They want the NHS dealt with. This massive backlog for people who want treatment. How much, you know, willingness is there to keep funding Ukraine, for example? We've seen the battles in the US Congress that desperately need artillery, long-range weaponry, and air defence systems as well, don't they? So how much willingness is there from the UK people to keep funding?
I think we're not like the Americans, that there isn't really so much of a debate of should we be spending this money in Ukraine. You know, this is much closer to us. We're aware of the stakes if Ukraine falls to Russian control. And I think at the moment there is a consensus that we need to keep supporting them. And I think a lot of British people are very proud of the fact that we have been quite forthcoming in our support for Ukraine. But the fact is, we know that, for example, sanctions, which used to be a tool in a geopolitical a way of putting geopolitical pressure on countries really aren't working, because Russia's economy grew greater than ours did last year, had more growth than ours did. And that is because there are countries that don't care about the fact that we've got sanctions. You know, China will still do business with Russia and so on. So we do need to spend money on military things. I mean, for me, I just feel that, given that poll after poll has shown that people aren't necessarily desperate for tax cuts when we all know that the country is falling apart. You talk about potholes, you know, what about, the NHS completely, not being able to rely on the NHS working. And I think the government does us a disservice if they assume that that's what we're waiting for. They can level with us, we can take it, we know that things need to be funded properly.
Yeah, interesting looking at the Daily Mail. Victory for the Mail campaign. The Mail campaign is don't leave Britain defenceless. The Mail is also one of those papers who wants to see tax cuts. So, you take your pick here, don't you? They're through saying there's choices to be made. There's choices now to be made for European nations as well, whether they match this sort of funding.
Well, of course, there are trade-offs to be made. Any government has a finite amount of resources. There's a limited amount that it's going to be able to bring in tax revenue that it can spend on public services. I think when we have the debate about the government spending side of the ledger as opposed to tax cuts, we often frame it in terms of education and NHS and welfare and the really, the big departments that soak up most of the government's spending. But actually, in my view at least, the government is at the moment trying to do far too much with the resources that it has. Its tentacles are spreading into almost every area, every conceivable area.
This is a big, small government issue, isn't it? I mean, do you mind if we move on and don't have that specific debate? Because it's no doubt going to be a long one. But yeah, I get your point you're making. So Rishi Sunak, back to action man status, some might say. It's off the back of the Rwanda bill going through last night. The Metro, of course, focuses on what happened in the Channel just hours after the Lords gave up on their ambitions to add amendments to the government's Rwanda bill. Let this be the last Channel tragedy, they're saying, Jenny.
Yes, I mean, 5 hours after this bill finally went through, 5 people dead, including a 7-year-old girl, 112 migrants packed on board a dinghy. These people died on the dinghy, and 57 people remained on board, said they didn't want to be rescued, and headed towards England. So these are people who aren't deterred by seeing people die on their boats. And the question is, will they be deterred by the idea that they could be one of the 200 or 300 people a year that are sent to Rwanda? Rishi Sunak using the opportunity today to say, this is a reminder of why our plan is so important. But the idea of this being a deterrent, I just don't see the evidence for it. It may have been a deterrent in Australia, very different circumstances of the migrants coming there and the seas that they're crossing. These are migrants that aren't deterred by the risk of death. And you'd think if they'll take their chances coming across the Channel, they would take their chances that they wouldn't be among those 300 people a year sent to Rwanda. And if we had spent this £300 million that we've already spent on Rwanda, which will equate to £600,000 per migrant that is eventually sent, I think, in the first year. If we had put that into, treating the smuggling gangs like terrorists and putting that money into intelligence to stop those people from getting near the coast, that would have been a much more effective way of stopping the problem.
And Annabelle, your paper picks up on this idea of these migrants continuing their journey. French police permitted the flimsy dinghy crammed with 112 migrants to leave the beach near Boulogne at 6 a.m. yesterday. This idea that the French are still not doing enough to stop the boats actually departing.
No, that's right. And of course, we've paid hundreds of millions of pounds to the French in the hope that they will stop these boats. Now, the authorities there have previously said they won't intercept in case it contravenes international maritime law. However, this simply cannot be allowed to stand. Crossing the Channel in this way is surely a crime. The pilot was endangering the lives of minors. And you have to ask why it was that the French allowed them to continue. As Jenny says, this boat designed for, 20, 30 people, had 112 migrants on it. It cannot have come as a great surprise to the French authorities that 5 people died as a consequence of it being allowed to leave their beaches. So, I think there's understandable frustration there. But of course, what this underscores is the complete disregard that these people smugglers have for human life, and how every effort must be made to try and smash these gangs that are causing such misery.
Well, plenty more still to come on our programme, including The Guardian reporting that the UN Human Rights Chief says he is horrified by reports of mass graves at 2 of Gaza's largest hospitals. Back with that and other stories in just a moment.
With lockdown, which it has an impact on a lot of things, people felt that they needed a dog as a companion because they were isolated. So during that period of time, there was an extra 4 million dogs bought. So before lockdown, we had about 8 million dogs in this country. After lockdown, we have 12 million. Now, a lot of these have bought dogs because of what they like the look of, or it suits their personality or type or whatever. Unfortunately, when I first started working with XL bullies, many, many years ago, as an expert witness under the Dangerous Dogs Act, I used to assess these dogs. They were quite reasonable. They were very, very reasonable. But what happened in about 2021 to 2022 is the bloodlines and varying other things changed. And because of that change, suddenly we found an enormous amount of more deaths. In fact, 4 times more deaths in 2022 than we'd ever seen over the last 30 years. 75% of all the deaths between 2021 and end of 2023 were down to XL bullies that did that attack, including a lot of other attacks that didn't end up in fatality. They wanted a different bloodline. There's a particular bloodline, and it's been said that over 50% of all the dogs in Great Britain are part of this particular XL bullies bloodline, Kimbo, over in America, and they transferred his sperm over here. They've been messing about with DNA and variant other things. And Kimbo, unfortunately, was a result of a pairing between a brother and sister. These dogs were bred initially for fighting, so they have a preponderance towards aggression in that case. A lot of these dogs have been very, very good, but some of these bloodlines, and in particular that one, Kimbo, is an absolute monster. It really is.
Well, welcome back. You are watching the press preview. With me tonight, Jenny Kleeman and Annabel Denham. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go to the Middle East, shall we? The Gaza crisis. First of all, the Daily Telegraph, Annabel. Israel is preparing to evacuate more than 1 million Palestinians from Rafah ahead of this planned ground offensive. I mean, this is serious stuff now.
Yes, this would be a massive evacuation. More than 1 million Palestinians. It will take 2 to 3 weeks for the IDF to achieve this before it launches its anticipated 6-week military operation. Now, of course, the IDF will insist that this is the lengths that they are willing to go to in order to preserve civilian life as much as possible. However, it's very difficult to see how the Rafah invasion isn't going to compound the scale of human catastrophe. As ever in this conflict, it's extremely difficult. Nobody wants to see or hear about thousands of innocent Palestinians losing their lives. But equally, were Israel to lay down its arms, Hamas would regroup, rearm and plan another attack like that seen on October 7th. So, you know, one can understand the position of Israel in wanting to defend itself.
And Rafah, the offensive, of course, comes with great international criticism, not least from the Americans and from Joe Biden, pre the Iran situation. In the meantime, questions and investigations demanded of what has happened at mass graves, specifically at one of the big hospitals in Gaza, Jenny.
Yes, it's Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, and reports from, and this is, of course, the Hamas-controlled parts of the government, of about 310 bodies have been found in the courtyard of this hospital over the past week. And The Guardian here focusing on the UN Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, and his concerns about all of this. There are calls for international investigators to go and assess what's happened. But we know that Israel doesn't even allow aid in, let alone external scrutiny, trying to reckon with what has happened here. You know, there is a prevailing culture of impunity, I would say, within Gaza on both sides.
How has Israel explained this then?
Israel has said that there were dead bodies that they checked to see whether or not they were the hostages that they've been looking for, and then they respectfully reburied them. But this is 310 people. And we know also that hospitals get specific protections under human rights law. So we don't know what happened there, and we're probably not going to find out for a very, very long time. We do need independent observers to go and find out what's happening, because we cannot rely on what Hamas is saying, and we also can't rely on what the IDF is saying either.
OK. Final story, which is Wales, in reverse over 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. They've pointed out there was always going to be a reassessment, but, you know, will there be a great repeal from 20 back to 30, do you think?
I think that's likely. I imagine that they'll keep 20 miles an hour in around schools, around hospitals, those sorts of places where it does make sense. But to have a blanket 20-mile-an-hour speed limit was pretty crazy policy to begin with. And as the Welsh Government have now said, on certain routes it hasn't been appropriate. Well, I think that anybody could have anticipated that it wasn't a necessary measure. But it does seem as though Wales has become a bit of a laboratory for some of the wackiest ideas. 4-day weeks in the public sector. They trialled a basic income and so on and so forth. So.
OK. Annabel Denham, Jenny Kleeman, thank you both very much indeed. We will see you for more, obviously, in the 11. All the top stories coming up for you then as well.